Are the Druze Muslims?
During the early 11th century, a ruler, Al-Hakim, d. 1021, of the Fatimid dynasty, a type of Sevener Shiites, did not argue when his followers began to claim that he was divine. Among al-Hakim's supporters was a Turk named Darazi. Even after Darazi died and his former arch-rival claimed that he himself was the true spokesman of al-Hakim, the name of Darazi would live on in the word Druze. Fatimid Ismaili doctrine had long shown very esoteric tendencies in interpreting the role of its 7 imams. And a similar esotericism remains a hallmark of Druze teaching. A collection of letters attributed to al-Hakim form the core sacred literature of the very closed and secretive communities, which now, for the most part, inhabit Lebanon, Syria, and the northern occupied West Bank of Palestine. Their esoteric teachings about al-Hakim, along with notions of reincarnation and other decidedly non-Islamic themes, leave them very much outside the fold of Islam.
Is number, letter, color, or animal symbolism important in Islamic tradition?
These and other types of related symbolism abound. The following examples provide only a hint of the variety of symbolism. Every letter in the Arabic language has a numerical value. A common use of number symbolism involves totaling up the numerical value of all the letters in a particular phrase and then using the number as a reminder of the phrase. For example, Muslims often repeat the phrase "in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful." It is called the basmala, after the sound of the first 3 words. Bismillahi, ar-Rahmani ar-Rahim. The numerical value of all the letters in the phrase is 786, and the symbol appears often in a sort of sunburst design, in pictures of holy places such as the Kaaba. Letter symbolism is especially prominent in classical religious poetry in languages like Persian, Urdu, and Turkish. Poets love to play on meanings suggested by the shapes of the Arabic letters. As for colors, green has come to be known as the color of the prophets, and of Muhammad in particular. Animal symbols, too, have been widespread in many cultures. Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, Ali, was known as the Lion of God because of his courage. Shi'i artists in particular often included images of a lion when they wanted to suggest the spiritual presence of the first Imam, Ali.
How is music important in Shinto ritual?
Gagaku, refined music, is ancient courtly music originating in China as early as the Han Dynasty and cultivated by the Japanese in Heian imperial circles. Often associated with dance, the 14-member instrumental ensemble consists of percussion and reeds. but it also includes the stringed instrument similar to the Hawaiian guitar called the so. Cousin of the larger koto, identifiable by its frequent use of the technique of note bending. A pluck string called the biwa is also part of the ensemble. Woodwinds are the three reeds, sankan, short, piccolo-like 6 and 9-hole flutes. A primitive oboe-like woodwind that produces a sharp, edgy sound. And a cluster of 17 bamboo pipes called the sho that is in fact a tiny pipe organ for the mouth. Slow stately rhythms beat out by the percussion underlie the haunting, almost plaintive sounds of the high-pitched reeds. Few sounds are a more apt musical communication of the sense of solemnity and perfect otherness of the deities the music addresses in Shinto shrines. Most non-Japanese who encounter music identified as Japanese are likely to associate that musical tradition with the sound of plucked strings, such as the koto and shamisen. In Shinto shrine ritual, however, stringed instruments do not play the major role they play in Chinese ritual. Percussion and woodwinds make up the bulk of the typical ceremonial ensemble. Percussion instruments include the massive taiko, a large barrel with two skin heads that sit sideways on an elevated stand just inside the outer ritual hall of larger shrines. A shrine ritualist, often one of the miko, deaconesses, announces the beginning of ceremonies by a pulse-pounding crescendo-decrescendo on the great drum. Various smaller drums keep time for dances.
Who are some important female deities?
Amaterasu, the sun goddess, is the most important of the goddesses. Hundreds of shrines throughout Japan are dedicated to her. One of the most colorful goddesses is Ama no Uzume, the terrible female of heaven. Widely popular because of her identification with frivolity and dance. A kami described as both masculine and feminine is Inari, because of her association with rice harvest. Inari is among the most important deities. Her messenger is the fox, and popular custom often refers to the fox itself as Inari. Bright reddish-orange or red torii gates. Sometimes in great numbers, usually mark shrines dedicated to Inari. A pair of goddesses associated with the war kami Hachiman appear in a sculptural triad with Hachiman. One is called Nikitsuhime, but the other remains to be identified. Seiryu Gongjin was one of several goddesses adopted by Shinto in their role as protectors of Buddhist temples. Two other imported goddesses with Buddhist connections are Zenmyo Nyoshin and Byakuko Shin. Stories tell of how a Korean monk fell in love with Zenmyo while he was studying in China. Byakuko was once an Indian earth deity who became a Shinto kami through her associations with powers of nature. Goddesses like Kumino Fusumai Okamai are often depicted round and full to suggest abundance. Goddess Tamiyuri-hime appears in a triad, flanked by two other goddesses. Once worshipped as the three protectresses of children. Tamayori was the daughter of Wadatsumi no Kami, Kami of the oceans, and Japan's first emperor's mother. Benten, also called Benzaiten, is a goddess of Indian origin. Hindus know her as Sarasvati, consort of the god Brahma and patroness of culture. She plays the Japanese lute, called the biwa, as Sarasvati plays the veena. And devotees beseech her for protection and for gifts of eloquence and knowledge. Numerous female kami have played important roles in Shinto life over the centuries. And some were frequently depicted in human form, but only a few remain significant in contemporary devotion.
Is there such a thing as a Buddhist saint?
Nearly all of the Mahayana denominations look to special embodiments of holiness for guidance, inspiration, and even the occasional miracle. Japanese Buddhists call some of these figures shonin, an honorific designation bestowed especially on patriarchs and founders of lineages and denominations. A group called the 18 Lohans, Lohan is derived from the Sanskrit term Arhat, are set apart from the Buddha's earliest disciples as uniquely sacred because of their unselfish commitment to spreading the Dharma rather than retire into peaceful solitude. Theravada tradition still uses the term Arhat, worthy one, to refer to a living embodiment of sanctity and wisdom. But the Arhat remains an ethical model only, and a rather distant ideal at that. Mahayana teaching sees the Bodhisattva as the ultimate in human potential. Some even confer the title on living individuals, such as the Dalai Lama. Bodhisattvas not only model spiritual perfection, but function as mediators as well, as emissaries of the various Buddhas. They exercise saving power and make comforting grace available to all who ask.
What is the ceremony of a Japanese wedding?
Contemporary Japanese weddings are celebrated in many ways, often combining traditional Japanese and Western elements side by side. Typically, a religious wedding ceremony is performed in Shinto style at a shrine located inside the hotel where the wedding celebration occurs. The ceremony is conducted by a Shinto priest and is attended only by the couple's closest family members. The couple is purified, drinks sake, and the groom reads a statement of commitment. The ceremony ends with symbolic offerings to the kami. The couple wears traditional Japanese garb. A reception is usually held after the ceremony. The wedding couple might welcome anywhere from 15 to 250 guests, relatives, friends, and co-workers. After the bride and groom are introduced, a meal is served and brief speeches are delivered. At the end of the party, the couple thank their guests for joining them on this important day. In recent years, many Japanese couples have incorporated traditionally Western elements into their weddings, for example, brides wearing white, Christian-style dresses. Sometimes the entire ceremony takes place in a Christian church and, according to a Christian-like ritual, even when the couple is not Christian. Many couples also perform other Western-style rituals, including cake cutting, an exchange of rings, and elaborate honeymoons.
How are Jewish religious leaders chosen and given authority?
In biblical times, religious authorities and specialists came largely from hereditary lines within particular tribes that traced their sacred mandates back to the Mosaic revelation at Sinai. Post-biblical developments gradually moved away from hereditary models of religious leadership to a parallel model in which one leader passes on authority to a successor by laying on of hands, called semika in Hebrew. Thus did Moses ordain Joshua and the 70 elders, Numbers 11:16-25, 27:18-23. Members of the Sanhedrin were likewise ordained. But post-biblical communities in the Middle East eventually did away with formal ordination, preferring only to see to it that prospective rabbis were thoroughly versed in Talmudic and legal studies. A number of modern seminaries, or rabbinical colleges as some are called, have broadened their curricula to include non-traditional studies, the better to equip future rabbis to engage more broadly educated congregations. The rich, age-old ritual of semika, imposing hands, survives largely in the practice of Orthodox rabbinical academies.
Do Muslims engage in any specific purification rituals?
Prior to each act of ritual prayer, Muslims perform a brief purification called wudu, pronounced wudio. Worshippers perform each of the following cleansing motions 3 times, rinse hands and wrists. Rinse out the mouth, then the nostrils likewise, rinse the whole face. Arms up to the elbows, whole head and neck, and finally toes and feet up to the ankles. Mosques today typically provide separate facilities in which men and women can perform the ablution. Older mosques often have fountains or taps running along an exterior wall, with small benches or stools for worshippers to sit on. They usually use tap water, but under peculiar circumstances even sand or earth is acceptable, in which case it is called tayammum, pronounced tawayyum. Clearly the idea is to prepare oneself symbolically to enter a special state of mindfulness. In addition to this cleansing, Muslims also regard a more thorough bathing, called ghusl, essential to restore the state of ritual purity after sexual intercourse, seminal discharge, or the menstrual cycle. Ghusl includes the motions of the ablution just described, but encompasses the entire body as well. The intent of these rituals is to put the individual in a state of maximum attentiveness to and spiritual worthiness for entering into the presence of God.
What was the earliest Daoist sacred text?
First and most influential of the Daoist sacred texts is the Dao De Jing, classic of the Way and its power. Traditionally attributed to Lao Zi, the text actually dates from between 300 and 250 BCE. Authorship and immediate historical context remain uncertain. Its attribution to the Old Master may have arisen out of a desire to lend the text greater legitimacy and credibility. The Dao De Jing's 81 tantalizing short poems brim with paradox. As they try to describe the indescribable by saying what it is not. Just as the value of a cup is the emptiness within, so the way progresses by, apparently, going backwards. As all of nature acts without conscious effort, so the person who strives in hope of gain loses all. The curiously attractive teaching of the Dao De Jing emphasizes the way of utter simplicity. Divided into two parts, poems 1 to 37 focus on the way. Poems 38 to 8 yawn on its power. Some describe the way as the passive principle and its power as primal spiritual energy. Anyone who tries to define the way must know that it remains indefinable. Dao is the source of all energy but eludes discovery. Imperceptible yet irresistible, impersonal yet ever-present, the Dao's power is like that of water. The softest of all elements inevitably dissolves the hardest. Although the text may sometimes give the impression that it favors the more mysterious female yin over the male yang. That is perhaps a result of its need to counter prevalent social biases. In the end, life can proceed only with a perfect balance of yin and yang. Mountain and valley, light and dark, dry and moist, evident and hidden.
What questions does the prospect of interfaith marriage raise for Jews?
Attitudes to interfaith marriages vary a great deal among Jews. It is probably fair to say that the preference of most would be that their sons and daughters marry other Jews. But resistance to interfaith marriage is certainly stronger among Orthodox and conservative Jews than among Reform. Virtually complete prohibition of interfaith marriages in some Jewish communities arises less out of concern for ethnic purity as such than out of a desire to prevent the faith tradition from being irreversibly diluted. Experience has shown that families in which the parents are not both Jewish are less likely to educate their children in the Jewish tradition. Tradition lost is extremely difficult to recover, especially in cultures and societies that seem to value the new much more highly than anything with deep historical roots. Even the musical Fiddler on the Roof goes a long way toward helping non-Jews to appreciate the beauty and centrality of tradition. Tradition, for Jews, families are the first line of defense against the permanent loss, not just of a collection of ritual deeds performed mechanically, but of the meaning of life itself as interpreted from a Jewish perspective.
What would I see if I visited one of the surviving CIT sacred places?
Beijing's Temple of Heaven, Tiantan, is perhaps the best example of such a site. The Chinese long ago mastered the art of creating monumental public spaces, as the temple demonstrates admirably. From its southern gate to the northern wall, the complex stretches half a mile along its main ceremonial axis. The compound covers an area larger than that of the Forbidden City, about 2 miles to the north, and it is some 4 times the area of its original northern Yin counterpart, the Temple of Earth. Whereas the temple compounds devoted to the feminine Earth and Moon are square in plan, those of Heaven and Sun are round-shouldered at their rear perimeters and squared off, like a large U shape, at the opposite ends where their entry gates are located. Confucian literati concepts of hierarchy in authority structures and in family lineage are based on a patriarchal model, and are evident in these as well as most other traditional Chinese structures. As you enter the main southern gate of the Temple of Heaven and walk north, you come first to the Altar of Heaven. It is a square enclosure surrounding a circular terrace of 3 concentric tiers round heaven surrounded by square earth, as in the overall plan of the site. The altar's symbolism includes its use of 9 courses of pavement on each of its 3 levels, 9 being the maximum level of yang energy. The posts in its surrounding railings, numbered in multiples of 9 on each level. Total 360, recalling the totality of degrees in heaven's circle. The circular hall of harvest prayer at the northern perimeter of the compound also stands within a square enclosure. Symbolizing the firmament, the triple-roofed structure stands on 2 concentric circles of 12 columns apiece, reminders of the months of the year and the Chinese reckoning of 12 units of time per day. 4 larger central columns inside the circle symbolize the seasons. Like the altar, the hall sits atop a triple-tiered circular platform. Geometric and numerical symbolism abound.
Who were David and Goliath?
David, second king of the Israelites, born circa 1013 BCE, is one of the most vividly portrayed characters in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. He was a warrior, lawgiver, musician, and poet, loyal to his superiors. Harsh in his judgments, ruthlessly cruel in war, but singled out by God for glory. He stands at the center of several crucial events in the history of the Israelites and has, accordingly, been a subject of exhaustive study among Jewish scholars for centuries. Christians have been almost equally fascinated with David, some seeing him as an Old Testament foreshadowing of Jesus, and others noting that Matthew's Gospel begins by tracing Jesus' lineage through the house of David. David is perhaps best remembered for his epic duel with the giant Goliath, begins I Samuel 17. A Philistine who was demoralizing the Hebrew army by offering single combat that no one dared accept. David, swearing that Yahweh would defend him, took up the challenge. He stepped forward, unarmed, and struck down the giant with a single stone from his slingshot. The Philistines panicked and fled, pursued and cut down by the Israelites. David is also known as the greatest of all Hebrew poets. Having single-handedly composed the biblical book of Psalms.
Do Confucians celebrate the birthdays of any religious figures?
September 28th of each year marks the birthday of Confucius in Taiwan. For example, and there it has also been declared Teachers' Day. In the People's Republic of China, celebrations of the day have been forbidden since the Maoist Revolution of 1948. Largely because of Confucianism's long-standing association with imperial rule. Taiwanese celebrations, however, are still elaborate and traditional. Beginning at 6 in the morning according to ancient practice. Ceremonies commence with ritual drumming followed by a procession in which participants, dressed in ancient regalia, carry in special symbols to welcome the spirit of Confucius. Processional symbols include a royal canopy and fan, as well as ritual long-handled axes. In the capital city, Taipei, the celebration is modeled on the ancient pattern in which literati bureaucrats performed the main rituals. There, the mayor presides over the various ranks of governmental employees and educational administrators, joined by ranks of students of different ages. Birthdays of particular deities or immortals do not play a role in Confucianism or CIT as they do in Daoism and CCT.
What is apostasy?
The term apostasy comes from the Greek compound apostasis, literally standing away or apart from. Hence rebellion or secession. It differs from heresy in several important respects. Heresy involves refusal to accept one or more mainstream doctrinal positions. But those holding the heretical views do not necessarily mean to repudiate the religious tradition altogether. In other words, heresy means a kind of selective rejection of religious teachings, often in the sincere belief that a certain view is simply mistaken. Apostasy implies a blanket rejection of a faith tradition, and a return to former views or to another tradition. So, for example, some early Christians reverted to paganism, and some 7th century Bedouin Arabs who had become Muslims rejected Islam when Muhammad died, and fell back on their ancient tribal ways. Official punishments for both apostasy and heretical beliefs have often been severe, including death, and have depended a great deal on the degree to which religious authorities exercised political clout. In the time of Constantine, apostate Christians suffered very harsh forms of banishment and loss of legal rights.
How have prophets figured in Jewish tradition?
Even in the Torah we find references to Abraham and Moses as prophets. And Moses is told that his brother Aaron will be his prophet when they confront Pharaoh. In those texts the term appears to be a still rather generic indicator of one who speaks for another rather than a reference to a figure of official or institutional status. Prophetic figures continue to appear during the days of the judges. Deborah is a prophetess, according to Judges 4:4, and Judges 6:8 says God sent an otherwise unnamed prophet to the people of Israel with a divine message. Prophets as an institutional class rose to prominence in connection with the monarchy. Samuel, called as a youth to special religious service, was both the last of the judges and a prototype of the court prophet. He served as critic and spiritual guide to King Saul, as the prophet Nathan would later be for David. Elijah and his successor Elisha are perhaps the most famous of the itinerant prophets of the early monarchical years, best known for the wonders they worked. But it is the writing prophets, beginning with Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, who seem to exemplify the quintessence of Jewish prophetic office. They left amazing records both of their experience of the prophetic vocation and of the content of the message they believed God commissioned them to deliver. Prophets are, in short, a constant presence in the biblical record. Post-biblical Jewish tradition generally assumes that the age of prophecy is over for good.
Are Confucianism or CIT appropriately called religious traditions?
Some scholars argue that the teachings customarily identified as Confucianism constitute a system of ethics or political philosophy rather than a system of religious beliefs. Imperial ritual, on the other hand, might qualify as an authentically religious phenomenon because it pays homage to deities called heaven and earth. Neither, however, has a distinct ecclesiastical structure, official ordained priesthood, or scriptures that claim the authority of divine revelation. Nevertheless, Confucian tradition has many important features that might identify it as a religious tradition. Partly because it has been historically so intertwined with the Chinese imperial cult and partly because of its strong sense of the sacred in ordinary human experience. Those features include an acknowledgement of transcendent power called the Dao, manifest in heaven and earth, and the long-standing reverence of Confucius as a holy one on a par with heaven and earth.
Do Muslims ever visit their holy cities outside of the formal pilgrimage season?
Hajj, or major pilgrimage, fulfills a religious duty only in connection with the formal season. But travelers to the holy city can perform the Umrah or lesser pilgrimage any time of year. Umrah is a strictly devotional activity, Optional but highly recommended. Rituals include a much scaled down version of important Hajj activities. To be more precise, Umrah is actually a component of Hajj that can be performed separately. Pilgrims enter into the state of ritual consecration by donning the same seamless white cloth worn for Hajj. Before entering the sacred zone surrounding Mecca, they proceed to the Kaaba, circumambulate it 7 times, perform 2 cycles of ritual prayer. Take a drink from the well of Zamzam, and walk rapidly 7 times between the small hillocks called Marwa and Safa. They conclude the lesser pilgrimage by clipping a lock of hair or shaving the head, symbolizing the spiritual change desired as a result of the pilgrimage. As at Hajj time, many pilgrims add a visit to the Prophet's mosque in Medina. But that is a separate devotional activity.
What is the season of Advent? Why is Christmas so important for Christians?
The Western Christian liturgical year begins with the first Sunday of Advent. Western churches set that Sunday as the one closest to the feast of St. Andrew, November 30th, while Eastern Christians begin a period of fast in preparation for Christmas on the feast of St. Philip, November 14th. For most Christians, 4 Sundays mark the season of waiting, an expectation of the birth of Christ. Christmas, the celebration of Jesus' birth, was originally fixed on December 25 around the year 336. That was the date then calculated as the winter solstice on the Roman calendar. With its symbolic celebration of the rebirth of the sun after the year's darkest day. In the practice of the liturgical churches, purple vestments still recall the originally penitential spirit of the season, with its overtones of apocalyptic expectation of Christ's second coming. But on the third Sunday, called Gaudet, Rejoice, Sunday, rose vestments introduce a note of relief. Christmas represents for all Christians the pivotal event in human history called the Incarnation, in which God took on human flesh and assumed all aspects of the human condition except sinfulness.
Do Buddhists engage in ritual sacrifice?
Sacrifice has never been part of mainstream Buddhist ritual. The Buddha himself rejected the ancient Hindu sacrificial heritage as spiritually bankrupt, as did many others among his contemporaries. Some later popular devotional Hindu sects retained animal sacrifice as an essential feature of ritual. But Theravada and Mahayana popular devotion have, in effect, spiritualized the concept of sacrifice. Traditional forms of sacrifice typically aim to appease a divine power. Buddhist tradition virtually does away with the concept. When worshippers make offerings of flowers, incense, and other symbols, they are not giving gifts to a spiritual power but offering signs of reverence and providing reminders for themselves of life's impermanence.
What is the Eightfold Noble Path?
True to his hard-headed realism, the Buddha did not send his followers off on a wild goose chase. He suggested a method for achieving a balanced approach to everyday experience. Buddhists call his teaching the middle path because it aims at balance, propriety, and equanimity. Eat what you need and use whatever is necessary for a modest style of living. The 8 elements in the classical formulation of the standards for such a life are divided into 3 larger categories: wisdom, ethics, and concentration. Achieving wisdom requires proper belief in the form of deep understanding of the 4 noble truths, and proper intent, which means that one performs all acts out of compassion rather than out of selfish motives. The next 3 steps on the path involve ethics. Proper speech means avoiding all evils of the tongue. Proper action, expressed negatively, means refraining from inappropriate sexual relationships, killing, and stealing. And proper livelihood calls for the avoidance of occupations that cause harm, such as dealing in slavery or weapons. Training in concentration also has a triple foundation. Proper effort means perfect balance in one's attitude toward work. Proper attentiveness flows from deep reflection on the 4 noble truths. And proper absorption, a lofty goal, means the ability to be genuinely content in equilibrium between pursuing goals and running from fears. Everything depends on carefully measured responses. That does not necessarily mean the death of spontaneity. It means a habit of discipline and keen awareness of one's personal motivations.
What rituals are performed at home?
Confucian rituals performed in the home have historically included countless ways of expressing various levels of familial relationship. Those that most closely approximate what the majority of people would likely recognize as religious involve ancestor veneration, described in the section on Daoism.
Are dance and drama equally important?
Bugaku, refined dance in 160 different styles, is often performed to the accompaniment of a gagaku ensemble and sometimes occurs in Buddhist temples as well as Shinto shrines. It is somewhat more formal and classical than Kagura, a uniquely Shinto form of liturgical dance with musical accompaniment. The name apparently derives from a term that means temporary abode of the kami, a place on earth to which worshippers summon the deities. Kagura has its mythic roots in the dance of the terrible female of heaven that lured the sun goddess to emerge from her cave. Unlike the more staid classical version danced for the emperor on December's full moon night. Shrine, or village, Kagura now reenacts often raucous scenes from mythological narratives. Several of the great shrines, such as those of Izumo, Kashiga, and Ise, are especially known for their long-standing traditions of Kagura performance. Some shrines have special structures dedicated to Kagura, but many still stage the dance in the large open space in front of the worship hall. Bon Odori is a popular form of folk dancing performed at festivals on shrine grounds. Celebrants dance around a large, raised, scaffold-like platform on which drummers and other musicians perch to play their popular Hayashi-style music. Perhaps the best known of Shinto-related dances is the dragon dance, often associated with festival parades. In shrine dances, the dragon begins by bowing to the kami and the chief priest before writhing its way across the sacred precincts. The ancient Japanese theater form called no also has roots in the reenactment of Shinto myths.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Daoism or CCT?
Most of the various schools and sects of Daoism can point to at least one source or compendium of their central teachings. In that sense, there is such a thing as Daoist doctrine. A body of doctrine does, in effect, define the boundaries of some of the schools, especially the more esoteric ones, and sets them apart from one another. But even in those instances, the doctrinal core is largely subordinate to a given school's central rituals and practices. CCT, on the other hand, does not define itself according to any clearly articulated doctrinal system. Children learn from their parents and extended family of elders a host of convictions and practices of the sort often called folk beliefs. Where there is no formally defined doctrine, there can be no dogma in the sense of a minimum required for membership. Of those Daoist schools and sects that have developed distinctive doctrinal tenets, only the most esoteric have even approached the kind of official dogmatic pronouncement one finds, for example, in Roman Catholicism.
Is there a distinctively Jewish ethic?
Every major religious tradition has its equivalent of the golden rule: treat others as you would like them to treat you. One classic Jewish version says, "Do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you." As a humanistic guide, it is very important, and pretty obvious on the face of it. But no religious tradition has ever just left the matter there, hoping their members would work out the details. Most readers will be familiar with the expression Judeo-Christian ethic. Politicians and preachers alike are fond of using the phrase as a handy, if rather vague, summary of values espoused by large populations like those of the United States. The term does not suggest that there are no significant differences between Judaism and Christianity as communities of faith. but it clearly implies that Jews and Christians generally agree on basic ethical principles. Most people would instinctively identify the Ten Commandments as that shared foundation of morals. But since for Christians as well as for Jews, the Decalogue functions as an ethical minimum, there is much more to both approaches to morality than one can squeeze into a handful of commands and prohibitions. This is where religious motivation enters the mix, making each tradition of religious ethics distinctive. Jews strive for a moral life because, in addition to the need for basic mutual respect, golden rule, and for broad guidelines meant to prevent social chaos. The Decalogue, the revealing God, demands nothing less of believers. Some Jews also draw motivation from the prospect of reward or punishment in the next life. Many find it sufficient that God has given all good things and wants people to share them so that more people can enjoy the gift of life. Since life's gifts don't always simply fall into one's lap and take care of themselves, believers need to work toward worthy goals and care the gifts attained.
What were the accomplishments of the Tang dynasty?
The Tang, 617 to 907 CE, was the sixth to last Chinese dynasty. It is well known because the period saw great achievements in government and business as well as in letters and the arts. Considered a golden age of Chinese civilization, the Tang was also an age of great expansion. At its height, the empire stretched from Turkmenistan in the west to Korea, which was a vassal state, in the east, and from Manchuria to northern India. One historian called the Tang the consummate Chinese dynasty, formidable, influential, and innovative. One of the Tang's innovations was the balance of administrative power. Government was separated into three main branches. The Imperial Secretariat, which organized the emperor's directives into policies. The Imperial Chancellery, which reviewed the policies and monitored the bureaucracy. And the Department of States and Affairs, which carried out the policies through the administration of 6 ministries. One of the most forward-thinking developments of the Tang dynasty was the growth of a civil service. Candidates for public service were trained in the Confucian principles before they took an examination that would qualify them for official duty.
What is the Daoist Celestial Masters School and why is it important?
Daoism Celestial Masters School, Tianshi Dao, also called Zhenyi, correct one, stands out as the original institutional expression of religious Daoism and one of several early attempts to establish theocratic communities. It was originally known as the 5 Bushels of Rice School. The dues expected of members, the Celestial Masters School. Founded by Zhang Daoling, 34 to 156 CE, in about 142, the sect focused initially on physical moral, and spiritual healing through ritual confession of faults and exorcism. Regular rituals included recitation from the Dao De Jing and communal meals, with special feasts 3 times annually to acknowledge the 3 celestial bureaucracies overseeing heaven, earth, and water. Over the centuries, the Celestial Masters School has worked to prevent the popularization of religious rituals by attempting to maintain standards in the training of ritual specialists. 2 main divisions, the Southern and Northern schools, developed more or less independently and then merged around the 14th century. After losing ground to various other schools for many centuries, the school has risen to prominence. In modern times and now generally dominates the formal practice of Daoism and its rituals. The school is represented officially by the 63rd master who lives in exile in Taiwan.
Who are Mahayana Buddhists?
By contrast, Mahayana Buddhists belong to a wide variety of sub-communities, for whom the historical Buddha called Siddhartha Gautama was one of many manifestations of enlightenment capable of saving those who ask for help. Mahayana scriptures evolved in some half-dozen languages over many centuries as the tradition moved through Asia. Mahayana teaching universalized a number of classical Buddhist concepts, broadening their popular appeal and expanding the religious options available to ordinary folk. For example, Mahayana teaching regarded the historical Buddha of this age, Siddhartha Gautama, as only one of many embodiments of enlightenment. Not merely an ethical model, the Buddha was actually a world-filling spiritual presence and power. The compassionate Bodhisattva supplanted the more self-contained Arhat as a religious ideal. Bodhisattvas represented saving grace as well as a lofty goal to which any person might aspire. Mahayana teachings expanded still further by personifying wisdom as a feminine principle, attractive and accessible. At the same time, somewhat paradoxically, Mahayana tradition was also a great deal more open to the sort of speculative thinking most Theravadins considered fruitless. Mahayana philosophers developed the concept of emptiness, shunyata, for example, as a way of emphasizing the futility of clinging to anything at all, even to neat doctrinal distinctions. Of the dozen or so Mahayana schools and denominations that arose in India, China, and Japan, 2 deserve special mention here. First and most popular are the Pure Land communities. Amitabha, Amida in Japan, one of the 5 transcendent or meditational Buddhas, rules the Western paradise called the Pure Land. Devotees seek rebirth in that heavenly realm through various spiritual means, including the simple repetition of phrases such as "Glory to Amida Buddha." In addition, several major Chan, Zen in Japan, lineages have been extraordinarily influential in Eastern Asia. The Soto school emphasizes quiet, methodical meditation, while the Rinzai school uses, in addition, the mind-stopping device called the koan to hasten the seeker's experience of enlightenment.
What is the Buddhist rosary?
Buddhists in many places have used a number of variations on the string of beads for devotional purposes. In ancient India, Buddhists used a string of 108 beads. Very similar to the ancient Hindu rosary, as a symbol of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. This compassionate being, whose name means, roughly, Lord looking down on the world, took on 108 human characteristics in his saving descent to assume the human condition, using the beads while doing so. Chinese and Japanese images of the Buddha, as well as of various patriarchs and monastic founders, sometimes show them holding rosaries for ritual purposes. The rosary has been particularly important in the more esoteric sects of Tibet and Japan. Tibetan rosaries have 3 larger beads at the end as symbols of the 3 jewels. Devotees in those sects use the beads to count repetitions of their mantras. In some more popular sects, devotees count repetitions of names of the Buddha or phrases like "Glory to Amida Buddha."
What is a Tao Tai mask?
One of the most common and important visual motifs in the arts associated with Confucian and CIT ritual objects is the mask known as the Tao Tai mask. Visit your local museum's Asian galleries and head for the cases that display the Chinese bronzes. Around the main part of the body of the object you will probably see what appear to be eyes and mouth arranged along a vertical that could very well be a nose. Look more closely and a face, like that of a large cat, will begin to emerge from the patterns of the rich design. Look again, this time examining the design on each side of the central vertical, and you may see what appear to be a pair of dragons rearing up toward each other. These mesmerizing designs have long fascinated art historians. The name Tao Tai means ogre or glutton, a name given to the motif perhaps because it suggests the visage of bottomless hunger capable of devouring all in its path. This terrifying apparition probably represents a deity from the ancient Shang dynasty pantheon. Its presence on the sacred ritual vessels is a protective device to safeguard the contents of the vessel. The Tao Tai disappeared from the Chinese decorative repertoire around 1000 BCE. But its early prominence and striking visual power make it a superb example of deep-rooted religious symbolism.
What do Confucians believe about ultimate spiritual reality?
Two of the most important concepts that define what Confucius and his followers thought about ultimate spiritual reality are the Dao and heaven, Tian. Confucian texts do not always make clear how the two differ, and at times it seems they are virtually interchangeable. In Confucian teaching, the Dao and heaven are generally non-personal realities that are equivalent, respectively, to a primordial or eternal cosmic law, Dao, and the source of that law, heaven. Early Confucian texts emphasize the immanent, rather than the transcendent, aspect of the Dao. For example, Confucius is reported to have observed that the Dao is very close to human beings. Dao is therefore accessible and knowable, but that does not mean the Dao is not also mysterious. Confucius did not simply deny the existence of transcendent realities. He preferred to interpret ultimate reality from the ground up, so to speak. Many of history's great theologians have constructed their systems of thought by beginning with the existence of some divine reality and working their way down. Not Confucius. He was interested primarily in the ethical implications of traditional teachings that he had inherited. He apparently thought of heaven as the ultimate moral authority or principle. Heaven makes its will known to, and through, an upright sovereign. What heaven discloses is, in turn, the Dao. Confucius reportedly described his Dao as consisting of two fundamental ethical components: responsibility or loyalty, yung, and reciprocity, shu. His interpretation of Dao and heaven is therefore quite different from the traditional Daoist interpretation. In much of Daoist thought, Dao has priority and gives rise to heaven, which in turn manifests the 10,000 things that many people call creation or the universe.
What is appropriate behavior?
The fourth truth says simply, to stop inappropriate craving, and follow the Eightfold Noble Path.
Where do Jews live today? Any estimates of numbers available?
Few nations of the world were without significant Jewish communities in early modern times. Many of those diaspora communities have dwindled considerably since the formation of the State of Israel and the open invitation to Jews to return to the homeland. Several million Jews now live in Israel. But by far the single largest concentration of local Jewish communities is in the United States. Jews have thrived throughout the Americas. European Jewry suffered dramatic losses as a result of the Nazi-led Holocaust. But since World War II, Jewish communities have begun to re-establish themselves in many major European cities. Jews number some 14 to 15 million worldwide. In the United States, a Jewish population of around 4 to 4.5 million is associated through over 2,000 synagogues and temples.
Does the form of ritual suicide called harakiri or seppuku have Shinto connections?
Ritual suicide has sometimes been associated with Shinto by way of the samurai code of honor. The principle behind taking one's life has been that one can be cleansed of shame incurred through bad judgment or ill will by means of suicide. Harakiri means literally belly cutting, a grim ritual in which the subject disembowels himself with a short blade while kneeling. His second then dispatches the subject by decapitating him with the longer samurai sword. There have been few publicized instances of the ritual, also called by the preferred and more polite term seppuku, in recent times. Surely the most famous such act was that of celebrated novelist Yukio Mishima. In 1970, most people no longer consider ritual suicide in any way laudable or virtuous, and certainly do not think of it as part of Shinto religious belief.
Where do deists live today? Are any estimates of numbers available? How about CCT?
Until fairly recently, Daoism has been an almost exclusively Chinese phenomenon. Since the Maoist Revolution of 1949, practice of Daoism in the People's Republic of China has diminished dramatically. Buddhism had the advantage of being an international tradition and thus of at least limited political utility. In addition, Buddhism qualified officially as a religion while Daoism was defined as mere superstition. Daoist temples and monasteries were shut down or destroyed, and thousands of Daoist ritual specialists had to seek other means of livelihood. Things have taken a turn for the better since the 1980s. Monasteries have reopened, and as of 1995 counts, Daoist temples number over 600, with about 10 times that number of nuns and priests. Some institutions have even managed to revive formal seminary training for ritual specialists. The Celestial Masters School and the Monastic Order of Chuanzhen Complete Realization School are the liveliest Daoist organizations in the People's Republic now. Many hundreds of temples are active in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Many more belonging to CCT than to specifically Daoist groups. Elsewhere in Asia, wherever significant populations of Chinese have gathered, such as Malaysia and Singapore, Daoism and CCT are growing but are still relatively small. Active Daoists may number several million, while adherents of CCT may number between 100 and 200 million. These numbers seem relatively small next to counts of other major traditions, but they do not include the many millions of people whose days are full of ancient symbols and small rituals. Even if they are not formally identified with the institutional trappings of Daoism or CCT.
What is meant by the term the rapture?
Some millenarian sects hold that at the second coming of Christ all believers will be taken up, rapt, into heaven. Only those deemed to be saved will enjoy the benefit of the experience. Numbers of the saved and the criteria by which to determine one's own or others' membership in that group vary. Some churches adhere to a literal reading of the scriptural text, according to which 144,000, equal numbers from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, will be sealed on their foreheads, Revelation 7:1-8. Strict interpretations limit to that number those who will survive the Great Tribulation. Revelation 7:14, that will precede the second coming of Christ. Others allow that the number is symbolic, though the actual number of those saved will remain relatively small.
Do Hindus have any special dietary concerns?
Good has always had powerful symbolic associations in Hindu tradition. Beginning with the ancient Vedic sacrificial rites. Not until the rise of Jainism and Buddhism, with their emphasis on nonviolence, did vegetarianism become part of mainstream Hindu practice. Brahmins have generally been more careful to observe vegetarian practice than have members of other castes. Among the various denominations, Vaishnavites have paid greater attention to dietary issues. All foods have specific effects on one of the three psycho-spiritual qualities called gunas, light or purity, excitement or energy, darkness or inertia. A traditional Vaishnava diet avoids foods that stir the passions, garlic, red fruits, and vegetables, or incline one to negative moods, flesh and intoxicants, while emphasizing those that have a positive effect, dairy products, grains, most fruits, and vegetables. Sannyas of all denominations are usually strict vegetarians. But the majority of Hindus nowadays tend to regard all foods, taken in moderation and as part of a balanced and healthful diet, as religiously acceptable. Most believe that strict vegetarianism is required only in ritual settings and in celebration of specifically religious observances. Some Hindus still refuse to take meals in the presence of members of other castes, whether lower or higher than their own, but this is a social rather than a dietary concern.
Why are Muslims buried in white shrouds?
Since Muslims believe that death is the great equalizer between rich and poor, kings and servants, burials are kept as simple as possible. The shroud is a symbol of that common destiny, showing that no matter how much a person owns, all is left behind when the deceased goes on to another spiritual life. Typically, a coffin is used to transport the body to the cemetery. Then the body is removed from the coffin and buried.
How does the agricultural cycle affect Shinto-related ritual celebrations?
Many festivities are still tied to various agricultural occasions. Spring and autumn festivals correspond with planting and harvesting. A large cluster of so-called spring festivals. Harumatsuri covers events that run generally from January to May, though some areas stretch the season into July. In late March or April, people celebrate Cherry Blossom Festival, one of nature's sublime but fleeting glories. On May 5th, 5th of the 5th in some places, other days elsewhere, many people observe a special rice planting day. Two of Kyoto's larger shrines, Kamigamo and Shimogamo in the north of the city, celebrate a prayer for good harvest called Hollyhock Festival, Aoi Matsuri, complete with elaborate processions and reenactments of ancient imperial events. With countless regional variations, the planting, or transplanting, rites occur generally during May, June, and July, stretching well into the summer season. This seasonal overlap is a result of using more than one system for converting special occasions from the lunar to the solar calendar. Some shrines host enormous gatherings centered around processions and contests of various kinds. Autumn festivals, Akimatsuri, include a similar grouping of celebrations that begin even before the summer festival season has ended and extend into October. At the beginning of each imperial era, the new emperor performs an autumn celebration called the Great Feast of New Food. Daijasai, offering rice to the sun goddess and imperial forebears. Whether in the imperial palace or at local shrines, these are all occasions for gratitude to the kami for bountiful harvest. Between planting and harvest are a host of generally smaller summer festivals. Natsumatsuri, during which people pray for a healthy crop. Some shrines, however, still host major celebrations during July, August, and September. Many of these are occasions for teams of younger men and boys especially to engage in spirited competition, vying to get their mikoshi along the procession route faster and arrive at the shrine first. Winter festivals. Fuyu no Matsuri revolve largely around preparations for the end of the year and New Year's celebrations, Shogesu. Calculated on the solar calendar, the winter solstice heralds the new year. So many people begin them with ceremonial cleaning and wrap up the old year by laying old sewing needles to rest at a local shrine. Honor for all things that contribute to human civilization, not for human beings alone that have come to the end of their lives, is essential. 7 days during a period called the Great Cold, Daikon, generally between January 6th and 21st, retain some of their ancient associations. People gather at shrines to enjoy the return of the sun in lengthening days that portend spring, and to pray for good fortune in general.